I can still hear in my head New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo's words at a press conference last year where he infamously justified his lockdown policies with the rhetorical line, "What is worse than death?" And now, as many parts of Canada slowly lift out of lockdown and secondary pandemics like the ballooning mental health crisis emerge, the question, what is worse than death, remains. So are there things worse than death? And who gets to make that decision for you? Who gets to decide? Who does the thinking for you? The government, the scientists, yourself, a combination? And with COVID, who should make healthcare choices for you and your family? Who is best positioned? Who really has your best interests or your health interests at heart? When children who have nearly zero risk of death of COVID are being asked to get vaccinated at the risk of side effects, including myocarditis, who has their best interests? When we hear rhetoric that we have a pandemic of the unvaccinated, is that really helping, or is that just causing division? Are we still all in this together? And how can we reframe our thinking in light of mortality, in balancing personal freedom? How can we approach the ethics of COVID from a compassionate standpoint that doesn't ignore the issue, but also doesn't compromise our constitutional freedoms founded on age-old principles? These are questions that require the expertise of not only public health officials, but also philosophers and bioethicists, experts in the fields of wisdom. So I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Julie Ponesse, professor of philosophy with a specialization in ethics at Huron College at Western University, to discuss some of the ethical issues. She also has a background in bioethics, which I think will particularly come in handy for this conversation. Dr. Ponesse, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks very much for having me.
Nice to see you. I'm glad we finally get to have this chat. So, I mean, I spoke about many different things in the opener. There's so many ways we can start with this conversation. But I think kind of the overarching thing that I see in society that many of us sense is a sense of fear and to some degree a moral panic. How do you see fear and moral panic playing into COVID policies?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think we are seeing a pervasive kind of panic, a pervasive kind of fear, and that people's decision making is being motivated more by fear than anything else. And one thing we know from looking at ethical data, psychological data, is that fear does not help us to make sound, rational decisions. And I should qualify that a little bit and say that a certain amount of fear for a certain amount of time can help a little bit. So if you think, you've probably heard of the fight or flight response, right? If you perceive a danger in your immediate vicinity, you sort of, adrenaline kicks in, other stress hormones kick in, and part of their job is to come to your rescue, to harness all of your intellectual and physical abilities in order to manage that stress. Right? Okay. But one thing we also know is that over the long term, you can reach a threshold beyond which those stress hormones are no longer helpful. And I think when you consider the fact that we have been going through this, and I'll just call it, the COVID situation for the last year and a half plus, that is an incredibly long prolongation of a human person being undergoing those kinds of stress hormones. And when we compound that with the fact that we have been isolated, socially isolated, so we don't have our social support systems in order to address and help to mitigate the effect of some of that stress. We're starting to see a number of studies now that are showing the really harmful, deleterious effects of fear on our decision-making when it comes to COVID. And one thing we tend to do when we're incredibly afraid is we tend to give greater prominence to the very small chance of something happening if we perceive it to be bad. Right?
Okay, Dr. Ponesse, we got to cut to a commercial break, but this is an interesting point, and I want to give you more time right when we return from these commercials. Please stick around.